It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Vines as our next presenter. I had a brief talk with Gary yesterday to find that we do have a little bit of common interest in identifying the historical sites of the automotive industry in and about Melbourne. Gary.
Well, I'm glad somebody has finally designed a headrest that will accommodate my pony car. This paper presents some preliminary thoughts on the evolution of the automotive factory design in Victoria based on a typological analysis of some surviving and documented buildings. It stems from heritage assessments that I've undertaken for the Fisherman's Bend urban renewal area, our next Docklands development, which obviously has the Holden factory in it, and several other places, and earlier studies, heritage studies in Dandenong and Broadmeadows that picked up places like the Ford factory in Broadmeadows and Campbellfield, and the geological and international harvest works in Dandenong. And it's always been my view that the car has been such an important factor in Australia's historical development that the places that reflect the car's heritage should themselves be given heritage consideration. Go to the origins. It's good hearing sort of the discussion so far about the connection between carriage builders and car designers, because we find a lot of those connections going on. Automobile manufacture in Victoria is around 120 years old, and it arose as an extension of the existing transport industry, primarily the carriage builders this time, producing horse-drawn road vehicles, but with pollination from bicycle makers, steam engineering and electric traction. The first car factories were therefore the blacksmith shops, farriers, coach builders, engineering works. Expansion, when they started building cars in any quantity, was achieved by adding more sheds to existing workshops until substantial capitalisation became necessary to avoid bottlenecks in production, and led in turn to purpose-built factories. These first took on the form of the standard masonry commercial buildings, brick and stone facades with timber frames. The south-facing sawtooth roof was borrowed from textile mills to light the workspaces. And as space became a premium, multi-storey factories were built in inner urban areas. The building forms evolved into a specialised daylight factory, which in turn was superseded by the sprawling single-level production line factories of the present day, and refinements of this last form have been in creating larger roof spaces to cover ever-increasing interconnected automated production lines. So we can see, this is basically the paper done there, but we can see in the buildings themselves both the technology that's involved in car manufacture, the economics that's behind it, and this historical sequence of change that's been occurring. The car factories are themselves both an enduring product of this industry, even after manufacturing of cars ceases in Australia, and also a source document to help understand the history of the evolution of the industry. So my work has been primarily in identifying, documenting, researching, and hopefully preserving places of industrial heritage in Victoria. Sometimes I don't feel very successful. It's like I've got a hit list of places that will then be demolished after I've found them. And I've often argued that the Toorak mansions and the Italianate town halls, the dramatic and important architecture was funded by the industry that actually employed people to make things and therefore make money. And in heritage protection, if we don't recognise that, then we're being incredibly elitist and only preserving one small part of what is really heritage. First one. The design or architectural character of these first works was the shed vernacular. Timber-framed, corrugated iron-clad, gable-ended structures similar to most commercial and farm buildings of the period. In more densely developed urban contexts, they sometimes earned a second storey, although this was usually only suitable for offices, storage, smaller manufacturing tasks. A large carriage entrance led either from the main road, announcing the building function, or from a lane behind. Would have seen this in a historic photo that Matthew had the other day. Herbert Thompson and Edward Holmes' steam car was built in their workshop in High Street, Armidale, just here. Like many small engineering works, this was a simple single-storey structure with a large entry to the street. Thompson's workshops are unusual in the elaborate brick facade, perhaps in keeping with the more salubrious neighbourhood. High Street, sort of near Armidale, has always been a bit of a posh area. And rather than the simple sheds that we find in more industrial areas. As his engineering skills and business were in component parts, the larger spaces needed for vehicle assembly, whether horse-drawn carriages or motor cars, weren't really necessary, but a public facade to his particular industry was important. James Alexander Holden out in Adelaide was just one of many carriage builders that made this transition to motor manufacturing in a fairly organic way. So you can see we've got a large carriage entrance. Large is sort of the Roman gauge, 5 foot 3.5 inches. The track between Roman wheels was designed so that when they built roads with stone strips for the wheels to carry on, they would all fit. When British standard railway gauge was developed, it was built to the same gauge, and most horse and carts had a wheelbase of about the same thing. So when we look at old buildings, we see these narrow entrances that you wouldn't get a Buick through these days. But they were built to this standard, and even the Ford Model T has the British standard gauge, railway gauge between the wheels. So Holden were initially repairing and maintaining imported motor cars, and then building sidecars and motorcycles under a partnership with Holden and Frost. In 1917, James' sons Henry and Edward formed Holden's Motor Body Builders to build car bodies in a shed at the rear of the firm's premises in Grenfell Street, Adelaide. In 1919, they established a new workshop in 400 King William Street. Now, many other carriage works simply transferred their skills to the new mode of transport by constructing bodywork to wrap around mostly imported chassis and mechanical components. Another avenue into motor car manufacture was through the bicycle. Kello's Faulkner, one of the oldest surviving motor vehicle builders and agents in Melbourne, was one of a number of businesses that commenced as bicycle manufacturers and repairers, in their case in 1889, and went on to manufacture, maintain and sell motor vehicles. Urban sites on busy roads also allowed a degree of advertising, both painted on the walls and in the form of the building itself. The Renaissance revival in Holden's works combined the urban commercial style and the utilitarian spaces behind. And we find this is sort of a typical thing with most industrial buildings that have any status to them, that they'll have an elaborate architectural design facade for the offices of the main entrance, usually in whatever the contemporary style is, sometimes cutting edge, sometimes retardé, depending on where that business fits in the progress of their industry. And then behind, all the utilitarian buildings, and we'll get into some of the Bauhaus ideas in that utilitarian design later on. Sometimes evidence of the past uses is found only in small details, such as the overscaled chimney on the side of Frank Northcote's coach and bodybuilding works in Elizabeth Street. This once served as a blacksmith or forge or foundry within the works. You can see in here a couple of shots there, the chimney the chimney sticking up when one of the buildings next door was demolished, and in the bottom left you can see it up against the new apartment building. Hopefully nobody's going to light a fire in there and smoke out the neighbours. Melbourne's early carriage builders were concentrated around the north end of the city, a logical place since the horse and hay markets were located at the junction of Royal Parade and Flemington. Road. We still call that big roundabout the Haymarket roundabout sometimes. And this was on the main routes to Goldfields, the Western District squatters and New South Wales. It was where the farmers came into Melbourne when they were doing their business and obviously would go and get their horses reshod, their carriages fixed, wander around the showrooms and buy things. This is still Walter Whitburn's works in Beckett Street. Melbourne's early, missed the line. The finishing line for the 1913 overland motor reliability test from Sydney to Melbourne was at the Haymarket. It was also the venue of earlier bicycle races when the sport became a fashionable form of transport in the 1890s. So this is the start of the 1895 bicycle race. The motor industry-related showrooms and suppliers continue to occupy this part of Melbourne. Elizabeth Street has became the motoring retail centre, so if you wanted to buy your new car, you would wander down the showrooms in Elizabeth Street. And the surviving motorcycle traders that are still there, tolerated by the council because I think it's providing a precinct of something, an activity, continues a tradition that goes back to the gold rush period. So we'll look at the first factories now. As motoring grew in popularity, so did the factories. Coach builders could not keep up, so the specialist automobile manufacturers came to be. Production line had been devised, patented and implemented by Ransom E. Olds in 1901, increasing fivefold the production capacity of the curved dash Oldsmobile. Henry Ford was quick to pick up on the idea and then set to create a production line factory to house this process. Now in Australia, mass production took longer to implement. We didn't have the economies of scale to achieve the benefits of mass production when our total market was so small. Efficiencies in manufacture did not return much greater profit, so you weren't going to make a lot of more money by investing in all of this infrastructure to produce larger amounts when the profits were really being made in small numbers of hand-built cars. So the manufacturing methods and the buildings housing them continued to stay in use. So this is not really distinguishable as a car factory. It would have looked much the same as an agricultural implement maker, a furniture factory, a whole range of possible industrial uses, apart from, I think in one shot, the doors open, some large legal entrances onto the main street. Import restrictions placed an important role in developing the auto industry. So following Federation in 1901 and the elimination of customs duties between the states, a prohibitive import duty was placed on car bodies in 1902. In 1917, the Hughes federal government, under the provisions of the War Precautions Act, prohibited importation of completed motor cars, but mechanical components and knockdown chassis were exempt from import duty. And this gave a continuing impetus to local manufacture of custom-built car bodies. So we already had almost a cottage industry of carriage builders providing a reasonably substantial market, mostly in agriculture and trade, but some private horse-drawn vehicles, and they were the ones who were being protected. Also around this time, all steel bodies began to replace timber-framed and sheet metal-clad construction, further contributing to this transition from craftsman-built individual cars to at least the potential for mass production techniques. The import ban during the war was soon lifted, but high tariffs on completed cars remained as the basis of protecting the local motor bodybuilders. I'm sure other people have plenty to say about Australian motor industry and tariff protection. So this is obviously the Tarrant Works. It was originally in Russell, corner of Russell and Little Collins Street. And we can probably see it as the first proper automobile factory in Victoria. The first Melbourne automobile makers can be therefore traced back to 1897, 1896 for the steam car, but here for the Tarrant when he built his first petrol-engined automobile. And although that was purely experimental, he was able to put what he learned into manufacturing cars on a commercial basis in 1901, with the assistance again of a Melbourne bicycle maker, Howard Lewis. The firm occupied a number of buildings in Melbourne with separate departments for machining, bodybuilding, assembly, painting, repairs and other functions. This is at a Tarrant site, Holden Spray Booth in Adelaide, but it gives you a sense of how the buildings were adapted to certain functions in each one of them. In many cases, each building took on a specific form determined by the type of manufacture being undertaken. Here's various apartments in Lygon Street, Lonsdale Street, Russell Street. So Tarrant Motors spawned several operating subsidiaries as well, including Smith's coach building business in Queensbridge Street, Melbourne, in I think about 1903, and in 1907 the motor body department took over larger premises in Exhibition Street with the title the Melbourne Motor Body Works. The Lonsdale Street factory. In 1909, larger premises in Lygon Street were required to accommodate assembly of Fords, and a new factory opened in the First World War. In 1925, Ford built their own plant in Geelong and cancelled the contract with Carriage, so the Melbourne Body Works then went on to build a range of British and American chassis. Some more views of the various interiors. The quintessential mass producer in Australia was probably H.V. Mackay, who in his Sunshine Harvester Works created a vast factory of timber frame, corrugated iron-clad, sawtooth roof factory buildings. Among them was the Scott Motor Works, initially created in 1910 by James Scott to manufacture small petrol engines for agricultural use. And Mackay took in a controlling interest and started manufacturing cars, some of his being built, including the Sunshine motor car. So everything Mackay built had Sunshine added to it, the Sun Drill, Sun Plough, the Sunshine Harvester. And I've yet to find and discover whether there is actually one of these Sunshine cars around. The Melbourne Motor Body Assembling Company had its origins as the building before it was demolished, Sunshine building, the sawtooth roof. Get on to Ruskin. This company had its origins in Tarrant Motors, and a new plant was built occupying the entire block between Batman Street and Dudley Street in West Melbourne, so this one's still there. It was known as Auto Car Industries for a while, and it's in recognition perhaps of Ford's new Geelong plant that the building employed a number of the most modern manufacturing techniques. So a description in the Argus plank. An interesting and unusual feature in the layout of the factory is the absence of lifts. Though the building is one of 3 stories, the necessity for lifts is avoided by the use of well-planned ramps, which make it possible to move a car under its own power if desired from bottom floor to top. On the chassis conveyor, the assembling is done stage by stage as the chassis is carried slowly forward on rollers. The heavier parts of the equipment are delivered by travelling trolleys suspended from overhead gear. All hand tools such as drills, spanners, riveters and screwdrivers are driven by compressed air. The interior, the plan of the works. In 1930, the works was recapitalised and renamed by the Managing Director Percy Strong as Ruskin Motor Bodies. The car bodies were made on numerous makes of chassis. They had a contract with Morris, another with Austin, and from the Hudson Terraplane chassis. The Morris and Austin accounted for much of the firm's workload up to the outbreak of the war, and then copied a lot of motor industries. They transferred to war production and increased their workforce to about 600. The Austin Motor Company took over Ruskin, changed its name to Austin Motor Company Australia about 1948, and then after the merger of Austin and Morris to form British Motor Corporation, most of the activities here were transferred to Zeppelin, to Victoria Park Racecourse in Sydney, and eventually this site was closed down. Like most large car manufacturers, Tarrant and Ruskin had to deal with the need to bring numerous complex manufacturing operations close together to ensure a smooth and uninterrupted production flow. In addition, very large and heavy machinery was required for stamping out parts, including whole panels, as automation replaced the handcrafted skill of the carpenter and metalworker. So the building needed very strong floors to hold these sort of presses. overview of the works. Holden as a comparison. The Dudley Street works, along with Holden's Adelaide works, represented a form of multi-storey factory that had developed in Europe during the urban textile mills in the late 18th century through the Industrial Revolution. It was refined at the beginning of the 20th century, primarily in America, to serve a range of mass production uses, but proved ideally suited to the motor industry. That's Holden's very similar works to the Ruskin factory. Look at the daylight factories now. Albert and Julius Kahn, engineers and architects in America, played a significant role in expanding the application of concrete reinforced building technology in about 1903 with the Kahn system, Steel Trust Concrete, or a company called Trust Concrete Steel Company, or Trustcon. They established it to implement this patent they had, but also to apply it to some of the specific buildings they were designing. Some consider Kahn more an engineer than an architect, but it was this marriage between disciplines that produced the reinforced concrete frame, allowing wide, clear spaces for the uninterrupted operation of production lines and improved ventilation, lighting in American automobile factories. I have to skip a couple of things, but never mind. The form reached its high point in this one, which is the number 10 plant at Packard. You might know it from sort of urban form photos of desolation and decayed American industrialism. And this style of works allowed light to penetrate, open spaces inside, strong floors to support machinery, and it was known as the Daylight Factory. Henry Ford took it over for his Highland Park factory in 1909, but the innovation was short-lived when Ford pioneered the moving production line in 1913, making a car in about an hour and a half instead of 12 and a half hours. The vertical building became obsolete. Instead, long, low sheds were needed, extendable in every direction. This multi-storey industrial buildings with exposed concrete frames filled with transparent glazing went to influence the architectural world. And getting back to what Penny was saying about the connection to the Bauhaus, Gropius included a photo of this factory in an influential essay on industrial buildings. And the craze for Americanismus, understood to comprise efficiency, rationalism and technological advantage, would transform advanced European architecture. Kahn's influence can also be found in the development of the single-level production factory. He designed buildings for Ford's River Rouge plant with this butterfly roof lights that we can also see in the Ford factory in Geelong. But it was the steel truss sawtooth roof building that became the ubiquitous car factory. So Ford doesn't actually have a lot of sawtooth roof, but it's got these strange butterfly roofs. And this is River Rouge, so this is Kahn. This is also taken from a photo by Walter Gropius, so he was certainly aware of the developments in the motor industry, and I haven't traced it, but I suspect some of this industrial design that was purely practical was directly influencing modern architecture in the early 20th century. The next major factory in Australia was Holden's Fishermans Bend plant. Created a consequence of the merger between Holden's motor building bodybuilders in Adelaide and General Motors in 1931. And again, while it was built before the war, it was used for wartime production, so that the first civilian production of the 48-215 J precursor wasn't until after the war. See the expansiveness of Fisherman's Bend in that period, and the factory plonked in the middle of it. In the post-war period, we see this massive boom in car manufacturing, again supported by tariff protection. Ford's Norlane plant, that was the precursor of the modern assembly factory in Geelong. It was insufficient in its capacity, so Ford themselves had to develop new plants, as did General Motors. In Port Melbourne, A&I were established in about 1952. It goes back to Eclipse Motors, who were manufacturing agents for the Standard Motor Company. And I think there's other people here that know the history of Eclipse a bit more thoroughly, so They went on in Port Melbourne to become Australian Motor Industries and were assembling Fiat, Triumph, AMC, Mercedes Benz, and in 1963 they secured the franchise for Toyota and assembled the Giara model, which my sister had one of. And it was the first Toyota car built outside of Japan. So we're not only acquiring all of these new factories, we're actually acquiring overseas technology in their manufacture as well. So, standard array of mine, Triumph Herald. And this development was part of some activities that were going on behind the scenes, where Ben Shipley had gone over and spoken to Billy Root from the Roots Group, with the idea of establishing a local motor industry on a larger scale with British influence. So we've still got this sort of interesting dichotomy between the American and British influence in car factories as well. The result didn't come through until after the war, when an experimental tank factory built by the government was then adapted to the Roots factory. This produced sort of Hillman and upper models, a variety of things, and then was merged with Chrysler. New, the expansive area, then the sort of Art Deco modern facade to it. GMH expanded by moving into a new factory in Dandenong in 1956 at a cost of £9 million, and also were assembling Bedford trucks in knockdown form here. The architects for this were Stevens and Turner, but I suspect they were only responsible for the glass curtain wall office building, and the actual plan of the factory was coming straight out of America. These buildings were being influenced now by international style modernism, mostly in their facades, but the utilitarian nature of the factory buildings continued. We've got Ford at Campbellfield at the same time, and then some of these other smaller manufacturers. Martin and King were a coach builder and railway carriage builder who had a big factory in Clayton, and they were assembling Volkswagens. Their factory, some of the production line in the 1960s. Renault were being assembled by Continental and General Distributors in Heidelberg, who were also putting together Simca Aronde, NSU Prince, Studebaker Lark, and Citroens, Peugeot. They sort of failed in the 1980s following low sales and probably political fallout from the French nuclear tests. And then Nissan took over the Clayton works later on. And finally, we get into this period of clearspan, a form of ultimate architecture where you take away any of the structure within the space that you're working in. You provide a roof that has no intervening supports, and the machinery of manufacture can go on unimpeded inside. This is the Zeppelin factory, which is probably one of the last big car factories built in Australia. I think one of the interesting things too is the point where a factory is built becomes the point that the factory exists forever. It's very rare that an existing building will be pulled down and a new building put up on the same site for modernising a factory. They'll basically try and make use of the space that they've got. See the sort of space frame trusses that are used to give wider and wider spans. And then this is the ultimate form. We have to go to China now to find the sort of factories that they're building. So I had a little appendix on showroom design, but I think I'll leave that to another day. But I have a finishing thing. So the loss of the auto manufacturing industry in Australia might be blamed on another number of factors: international trade treaties, local economic and political responses to globalisation, the shift from protectionist to free trade policies. But I think another factor has also been that the industry has fallen behind in the technology of manufacture. And that's partly to do with economies of scale. We can't build enough, we can't build the factories that are the most efficient. And that is represented in the design, the scale, and the form of the factories themselves. So in all of this, I'm just saying we've got an archaeological record of the history of Australian motor building, and I think it's something worth studying. So thank you.
Gary's interesting talk has led us on, and we've got time for one question. If somebody's got a question. Up the back.
What's generally happening to these sites after the factories close down? Are they being gentrified, or are they turning into sites of other production?
In most cases, once you've got one of these massive sites, it's constrained in what it can be used for. The earlier buildings that have a forest of timber posts in them are pretty much useless for any industrial purpose, apart from just self-storage or fairly informal things. So most of those timber frame buildings have been pulled down and replaced with industrial parks. The really big steel frame buildings tend to just be spaces for storage, fairly informal. So there's lots of sort of car retailers and wholesalers using it for storage. Some manufacturing going on in them, but ultimately they're basically going to be pulled down and removed. And that's sort of the Fisherman's Bend thing. Is that the future for Fisherman's Bend is more like docklands. There'll be an employment precinct, but it will be modern, smaller scale, technological employers rather than big mass production factories. The nature of heritage protection in Australia is that the architecturally elaborate facades are recognised and protected. The spaces where the things happened that made the place important are too hard, and so we generally lose any of the manufacturing space, but we might keep the offices.
I could just add, if you go to Fisherman's Bend and look at the original old site, there's really only half of it left in terms of the factory. The rest is totally been bulldozed and has a new office block built inside.
I just want to make a very quick point about because my particular interest for this conference was on Repco, and I'm wondering if you're just looking at factories or if you're looking at places like Repco, which wasn't an automotive manufacturer or assembler, it was a component manufacturer, as you know, but there's quite a lot of architectural remnants of Repco around North Melbourne, Richmond and so forth, the inner suburbs. So you can still, particularly if you've got any, I mean, the Queensbury site really needs to be put on the Heritage Register because it's still there, and that's where they started out in North Melbourne, and that's a really important building. But there's little bits of Repco around North Melbourne. I think I've identified a couple of little things that look like they're little early factories and things. That might be another business to put on the radar.
There's certainly a lot of component manufacturers and people who are feeding into the auto industry, and people like Borg Warner and Bosch, and their places I think are worth at least trying to find what's left of them. Whenever I get the chance, I'm sort of arguing that if we're not going to have an automotive industry, we should at least have a heritage study of what's left of it, and perhaps have some automotive manufacturing heritage preserved. It's the sort of thing that has been done in the past in thematic studies at that point of transition, and we've got a window of a few years or a decade where we can do the study. In the meantime, everything's going to be demolished. We're not going to stop that happening. But yes, certainly, if I could get someone to fund me, I would be quite happy to go and research all of those places.
Thank you, Gary. Put your hands together.